Have you heard of the Gospel Stream app? Well, neither had I, but turns out there's an app that allows you to access every uplifting video or live broadcast, general conference, inspirational messages, and even your local church meetings where available. It's like the app I've always wanted and never knew existed. Gospel Stream is the official video streaming app of The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and is available now for free in the Apple App Store, Google Play, Roku, or Amazon. If you're like me, the word lament is one you've heard and have a vague idea of its definition, but I felt like a whole new world was open to me as I read the new book, Even in the Darkest Hour, Lament as a Path to God. In it, author Michael Huston writes, "Far from faithlessness and betrayal, a remarkable feature of lament is that through the process of lament, the one who laments doubles down on the existence of God and the reality of a covenant relationship by taking their heaviest burdens directly to the source of all life, God." So, what if it really is okay and even a form of worship to express when things are hard if we take those things directly to a God we believe in? Michael Huston currently resides in Central Maryland. He received degrees from Utah State University, American University, and Wesley Theological Seminary. Though he spent most of his youth west of the Mississippi, he has lived on the East Coast for more than 20 years. He and his wife of 23 years have 4 children. This is All In, an LDS Living podcast where we ask the question, what does it really mean to be all in the gospel of Jesus Christ? I'm Morgan Pearson, and I am so honored to have Michael Huston on the line with me today. Michael, welcome.
Hey, thank you for having me.
Well, I told Michael this in an email before we started recording, but as I have read this book that Michael has put so much time and effort and study into, I felt like I needed the message in the book. And so I'm actually so excited to be able to dig a little bit deeper into this topic as we talk today, Michael. But my first question for you, as I read the book, I was so intrigued to know what sparked your interest in this topic of lament. And just to kind of lay the groundwork for those listening, I wondered if you could share with us what is lament.
Sure. No, this is actually, I'm glad you're starting with that question because this actually is kind of framing for a lot of the conversation that's going to follow. If you don't mind me doing a little bit of personal history because this all plays into it. I grew up in the LDS church. I was, my parents joined when I was very, very little. But so functionally I've been born and raised in the church. And there came a time when I really was thirsty, hungry. I needed something. And after a lot of conversation with my wife, I decided to go to Wesley Theological Seminary, which is a Methodist seminary in DC. And so what I would do is at the time, my kids were getting older. I was working full time. I would leave work, go to Wesley at night, study there, and then come home. And over the course of a couple of years, I finished my master's there. One of the courses that I took was an introduction to the Old Testament. It's a year-long course. It's required for every seminarian. And we got to the wisdom texts, the Psalms, Ecclesiastes, Proverbs. And the teacher that I had was a lady named Denise Domkowski-Hopkins, who had written a book about the Psalms. And she was introducing the Psalms to us. And one of the things that she talked about in the course of this sort of survey was the lament psalms. And I will admit that my only real familiarity with the word lament was the book Lamentations, which for the most part we skipped, right? In gospel doctrine, even in seminary, we kind of yes, and Lamentations, and then we would move on. And so it was really foreign to me. And so she was like, this is lament. Lament is faithfully complaining to God. And I just thought, wait, what does that mean? And so she started to unravel this and explain that in the Psalter, in the book of Psalms, which are, just prayers or songs, there were all different kinds of psalms, which I had kind of known, I guess, but hadn't really sort of unpacked. And she was like, there are praise psalms that praise God and say how wonderful God is. And there's a bunch of them, and you can find them here. And then she would list them off. And she's like, and there are thanksgiving psalms where they, you say how grateful you are for things, and they would list them off. And she's like, and there are lament psalms. And lament is the way you worship to God from within pain. And she explained that, when everything is wonderful, we praise. When we're grateful, we offer thanks. And when we hurt, we lament. And all of them are ways of worship. They're just different modes. They're different languages of worship. And it floored me because I had never, ever heard that in my worldview, right? And I grew up, like I said, in suburban white America, LDS church, right? Like in my worldview, worship always ended with an exclamation point. That's how it sounded at church. Everyone talked about how great everything was. And even if you felt bad about it, you always end it with like, but everything's going to be fine, or but God has a plan, right? Like everything always concluded with an exclamation point. I had never considered the notion that one could worship through expressions of pain. Like it was a brand new idea to me. And when I heard it, I say this in the book, that it felt like I had exhaled a breath I had been holding for a very long time. Like I didn't realize how much I needed to be able to say to God when I was hurting, but not say, I'm hurting, but I know everything will be okay, right? Like not to caveat it, just to be able to say, I hurt. And that expression itself was actually a form of worship. And so, like I said, that for me just was groundbreaking. Then what happened was later on, I graduated, this was sometime later, I was leading a discussion and we were talking in Sunday school about section 121. And section 121 starts with 6 verses of lament, where he's like, oh God, where are you? Why are you hiding your face? Why do you let all of these bad things happen? And I remember being struck by that because I was like, oh, I knew it was there. But like whenever I had studied 121, we had always, again, sort of like hurried through those verses and skipped to verse 7, where God starts talking about all the things that God's going to do. And so what I did instead was I focused on verses 1 through 6. And we talked about how powerful it was that Joseph Smith lamented. And then I pulled in some of the lament psalms and read those. And we pulled in actually Jesus laments from the cross. He uses laments as he's dying. And we talked about like the power of lament. And it was really interesting because you could see, or at least it felt like to me, like in the class, people were like, oh, that's really interesting. And so it was in that moment that I thought, it's not just me. Like this is a tool people need. And so I went home and wrote the book. I mean, that was like that's kind of how I got here. And it was, my experience has been that people who have come across this idea, like the LDS folks I go to church with who have come across this idea, who have read the book, almost universally say, I didn't know I could do that. And I feel like that's both on one hand really unfortunate, but on the other hand, I'm really glad that they know now.
Well, I completely agree with the fact that it feels like when you understand what you just described as being lament, it does feel like, oh, like that's okay. Because I think that we are so wired within our culture to be optimistic. And we have reason to be optimistic and hopeful. We talk often about an eternal perspective, and I think that that's important, but that doesn't mean that there's not space for some things to be hard. And I actually just had a conversation this last week with some friends, and we were talking about kind of just this being a more difficult season for a couple of us. And one of my friends said that her sister-in-law often reminds her that no flower blooms in every season. And so I think it's important to recognize like there may be seasons of lament. There may be seasons of this optimism and enthusiasm. And like you said, there are places for all those different kinds of worship. Okay, now that we've talked, Michael, about what lament is, you talk about how there's a specific structure to lament in the scriptures. Can you share a little bit about what that structure is so that maybe people can recognize it more when in their own study?
Sure. Yeah. And what I'm going to describe is lament as we see it in the Psalms, which again are very structured. So like they're built to be this structured. And what's interesting is once you start to see the structure in the Psalms, then you can kind of transport it outside and go elsewhere. But lament generally has four parts. There's the address, dear God. There's the complaint. Why is this happening? And in the Psalter, it's all kinds of different things. Like, why are my enemies prevailing? Why do I feel so sad? How come my crops are failing, right? Like, all of those things happen. Then there's the petition. Basically, it's a challenge to God to be God. It's like, okay, so if you're God, fix it. And then there's the motivation. Because I need this, because I'm hurt, because my family's hungry, because if you don't act like God, then maybe they'll think you're not powerful, right? Like those are the portions of lament. And again, what I think is fascinating about that is it's worship. It's how you worship when you hurt. You go to God and you say, God, I hurt. This thing is happening. Why aren't you acting? And then all of the laments, except one or maybe two, have a thing called the turn, where eventually the person who is lamenting is able to turn to praise. They eventually get there. There's a confession of trust. But I know, right, in the Book of Mormon and 2 Nephi 4, nevertheless, I know in whom I have trusted, right? And then there's this vow of praise. Almost all laments eventually end with praise or thanksgiving. But what I think is interesting is we have to remember that just because the sort of the complaint portion of lament and then the turn portion of lament in our scriptures all happen next to each other because it's a compressed text, we need to remember that in our own lives, those things don't always happen temporally next to each other. Often there's a big gap between the expression of lament and the turn to praise. And even in the scriptures in Psalm 88, there is no turn. It's just lament, and it ends in lament. It's actually, it's heartbreaking when you read it because it means that even that has a place in worship, that we don't always have to get to the turn. Sometimes just the expression of pain is enough, if that's all that we can muster. And I just think once you start to sort of grab that, it just feels so raw. Like there's a visceral almost reaction that happens when you get to that moment. Anyway, I've sort of strayed off course. That's the structure of lament, and then we can find that structure in lots of different places.
Okay, this is so good. I already feel like I'm learning so much. So just to clarify, and you talk about this a bit in the book, that some might be a little bit confused about the difference between murmuring, which we read about in the Book of Mormon, or just simply complaining, and lament. So can you explain a little bit about what the difference is between these things?
Yes. And I'm really glad you asked that question. It's a question that's actually important to take head on. So probably the most thorough examination of murmuring is Neal A. Maxwell's talk, Murmur Not, so everyone can go look that up. And in it, he describes murmuring with sort of three parts. He describes it as a complaint about God intended to provoke others that does not expect a response. That's what murmuring is. It's when you complain about, like, can you believe God did this to us? Look at us now. I mean, we're in a bad spot. So, but there's no expectation that God's either hearing or is going to respond at all. And that's what you see. I mean, that's sort of like classic Layman Lemuel talking, right? Is the complaining about God intended to provoke without a response. Lament is exactly the opposite in every regard. It is complaint, but it is complaint directly to God. And it's not intended to provoke other people. It is intended to petition, and it is premised on a rock solid faith that God is both listening and will eventually respond. And I think that when you start to that difference is actually quite stark, because if you think about, again, Lament and Lemuel and Nephi as sort of opposites, Lament and Lemuel were like, God did this to us. It's really awful. You should think it's awful too. And he doesn't listen anyway. And Nephi is like, God, why is this happening? I don't understand. I believe it can be different. And those are very different. And the murmuring is just that. Lament is actually a form of worship. But it's because it's directed to God. And it's premised on faith at its core.
So murmuring essentially is talking about God behind his back.
Yep. Yep.
I think that you did such a great job explaining that. Okay, so you talk in the book about how the point of our life here on earth is not to avoid sadness. And you say that expressing sadness and grief can be an act of faith and worship, which is what we've kind of been talking about up to this point. But why would you say that experiencing and also expressing sadness and grief is a crucial part of our mortal experience?
Yeah, I mean, listen, we live in a world where it seems like the highest good is avoiding pain. That if we just do enough, whatever, fill in the blank, if we run enough or eat well enough or whatever, that we can avoid pain, sadness, tragedy. And that, we know that's not true. The best of the best experience pain, sadness, and tragedy, just like the worst of the worst. We all go through it. And it was always intended to be this way, right? Modern scripture talks about life as an opportunity to be proven, which implies hardship. And in 2 Nephi 2, Lehi talks about the contrasting of the bitter and the sweet, and that, the joy and misery, that without the one we can't experience in the other. And if we are not willing to accept the fact that we will have sadness, we can't really embrace the reality of happiness. The two are so connected that they can't be broken apart. And so rather than and I'm not saying that we should go around and try to make ourselves miserable so that we understand what it's like to be happy, but rather than trying to live our life as if experiencing sadness, grief, and tragedy is somehow a condemnation of our failure to live faithfully, which is, I think, sometimes what we do, we should live our life recognizing that we're all just going to have sadness and pain and tragedy, and that's part of this existence, but that it's okay, partly because it helps us understand what joy and peace and happiness looks like, but also that God has given us a language of worship for those moments. That God doesn't expect us to just it's not like pain and sadness and tragedy are something that we must figure out how to get out of in order to worship. We don't have to avoid it. Michael Card said, lament is not the path to worship. Lament is the path of worship. Lament is a mode of worship. And so once we can accept once we can accept, I think we can kind of actually do this backwards. Once you accept that there is a language for worship from within pain, suddenly feeling pain isn't bad. It just is. And we can worship there too. And so I think that's really a kind of different worldview than the sort of positivity mindset worldview that we've kind of grown to experience in Western North American culture. I mean, that's just the way we tend to view the world.
Absolutely. And I love that you brought up 2 Nephi chapter 2, because one of my favorite parts in the beginning of the book, you talk about the line in the Book of Mormon, men are that they might have joy. And you write that for Lehi, this was not theoretical how do you even say that word?
Theologizing?
Yes, thank you. I was like, I'm going to put that in there, but I don't know how to say that word. But I loved that you said what you said about this idea of the word might in that scripture, and that this for Lehi was something that he was intimately familiar with. Could you share with listeners what you wrote about that?
Sure. Let me take a second to talk about Lehi, because that was actually kind of a discovery I made in the course of writing. I hadn't really sort of put this together in the way that I did until then. Lehi's a really interesting cat because, like, on the one hand, he was he had this vision of the tree of life. He tasted the fruit. He knew what it felt like to have God's redeeming love. But he also knew at the exact same time the anxiety of having children that he was worried about. He knew what it was like to feel God's revelatory power in Jerusalem, and he also knew what it was like to be outcast, right? Both of them existed at the same time. And as he's close to dying, he talks about how he's filled with great anxiety for his children at the same time that he feels embraced by God's eternal love. And so I think Lehi sort of embodies this duality of happiness and sadness in a way that maybe we don't truly appreciate often. And in his blessing to Jacob in 2 Nephi 2, we get the sort of maybe the most famous verse ever, right? Men are that Adam felt that men might be, and men are that they might have joy. And we read, in 1828 English, might it's the preteritive tense. Like, there's grammarians out there who are going to quibble with what I'm about to say. So just to be like, yes, I get it. It's a preterite tense, and it was meant to say they have the freedom or power to do it. Like, Adam felt that men might be. He is free now to do it. And men are that they might have joy. In other words, they have the power to have joy. All true. But I play a little word game talking about the word might. And in our, the way we use the word might now is to introduce ambiguity, uncertainty. Like, if someone says, did you go to the store? And you answer with, I might have. Suddenly we don't know if you went, right? And I think it's interesting that of all the ways that scripture could have been communicated in English, will have, ought to have, must have, he uses the word might have. And I feel like what I suggest is that we live in a world of mights, that joy is not the inevitable outcome of this existence. Sometimes misery will be there too. And that if we read Adam fell that men might be and men are that they might have joy, to say that somehow just living good enough will mean that you will always be happy, I think we do ourselves a disservice. I think we should lean a little bit more into the word might and say, men are that they might have joy, but they might not. And that's okay. And I think that reading actually resonates with the rest of the scripture, with the rest of 2 Nephi 2 anyway, where Lehi is very clear that sadness and happiness, joy and misery go together, and that to sort of privilege the one over the other is to miss kind of the point of all of it in a lot of ways.
So interesting. Okay. There's so many things from this that I want to make sure that we get to. So I'm just going to keep moving. You talking is better than me talking, but you have a whole section in your book about what lament might look like, not only personally, but in our families, in our church congregations, and even in our communities. So I wondered, how does this look for you personally? And how does it look in a community in which you're involved?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. I will admit that, and I'm going to give Desiree Book credit for this one. When I wrote the book, I actually didn't have any real personal examples because I'm not, like, as a human, I don't lean that way. So they came back and they're like, this is great. You need to provide some personal examples. And I was like, oh, okay, fine. And it was actually really, really hard because those moments are tough, right? Like, talking about lament requires talking about the times when you felt vulnerable and exposed.
Which is hard when that's not your natural personality.
Yeah, well, and especially, again, I was raised to not feel that. And so it's really sort of pushing against my own kind of predilections. But in reflecting back, I think there were a couple times when I could talk about it in my own life and then in my small communities. But before I do that, let me say that I think a lot of people do this intuitively. I don't know if they know that they do it, where they'll express lament. Sometimes they feel bad about it afterwards because they don't know that it's okay to lament. But I think when I explain this, I think people will be like, oh, I've done that before. So probably the best example that encapsulates both is 9/11. I know that we have lots of different age groups that listen to this. I was a little bit older. I was in college when this happened. And for those of us who remember that moment, like it was like the entire world was thrown into uncertainty. Like we literally didn't know if we were going to be attacked again. I thought that the whole financial system was going to collapse. Like it was incredibly, incredibly scary. In my own life, the way that looked was me going to God and basically saying, right, in the following in the address, complaint, petition, motivation, like, God, why did you let this happen? I'm just trying to live my life and graduate from college and have a family. Can't you make this better? Because like I didn't know what I was going to do. And I asked a lot of hard questions of God because I started to realize that like all of a sudden I wasn't unique. In fact, the fact that I hadn't experienced that made me unique. Now I was just more like everybody else all over the world who had experienced trauma just like that, or worse, or closer to home. And so for me, that was a really sort of moment of me taking my pain to God. But what was powerful about that moment was that there were also spaces where we did it together. I remember going, because I was in college, they had a vigil because no one knew what to do. And we went and we sat on, the quad, and it was sunset, and, we were up in the mountains, and a member of the band, he played taps, and it like echoed through the valley. And all of us just kind of sat there, and we just kind of hurt together. And, there was power in that. And no one was trying to explain why it happened. No one felt compelled to say, but it's okay because God has a plan, right? It was just us sharing in pain. And it was even today, it moves me to tears thinking about it. Like it was a remarkably powerful moment. And what I think is interesting is, again, like at the time I didn't know what I was doing. Like it just felt right to sort of express these things by myself and to be with people and express them together. But upon reflection, I realized that I was lamenting. That's what I was doing, as I was expressing pain to God about what was going on, and in my own way, petitioning God to do something about it. So I think those are examples, I think, of how it works individually and in a community. But I want to be clear that like how that works in individuals' lives and in different communities can really vary, because like trauma looks different for different people, and tragedy, we all experience things differently. And so there isn't really any one way or one thing about, to lament or about which we should lament. It really is like what hurts us or our communities. That is the subject from which we can build lament as worship.
I love that example that you gave, because I think it hits home for, like you said, there are different ages that listen to this, and I'm sure that we have a younger audience who doesn't remember that, but I think many listening will remember that and how their own lament looked in that moment. You discussed that there is a danger in refusing to lament. I feel like we've talked about, so many of us try so hard to remain optimistic and to be positive, and we don't want to seem like we're complaining. But why is it important to lament?
Yeah, so I think the most grounding way to talk about this is to talk about it in a more intimate relationship that maybe we're familiar with here. So with my wife, there are times when I need to go to her and say to her, "You're wonderful. Like, you're the best thing ever. You're the bee's knees. I can't imagine life without you." And there are times when I can go to her and say, "I am so thankful for all the things you do for me." And there are times when I need to be able to go to her and say, "This thing, it hurts." And I think in the context of our earthly relationships, like, that feels right. Because if we are never able to say to our spouse or our significant other, our partner, our kids, whatever, if we're not able to say, "I hurt," then what's happening is the relationship is never really open. You're always holding something back. You're keeping something behind a wall. And if we want to have the kind of authentic covenant relationship that is required, right? Jesus says, like, this is life eternal. Salvation is to know God. If we want to know God, we have to be able to have all of us out there, not just like the pretty parts and not the parts that sound good, like all of us. And we have to be able to believe, to trust, to have faith, whatever the right verb is, that God accepts that. And I think if we refuse to lament, we are both holding something back and lacking an element of faith. I don't know if that's too hard to say. Maybe that feels too pointed. But if we don't have the trust in God that we can say how we feel, like, how can we expect to build the type of relationship that can carry us through the eternities? And so I think if we refuse to lament, we are stopping our own relationship building with God. We are hindering our own spiritual progress. Lament isn't just a nice to. It's not just like an accoutrement of faith that we can put on if we need it. Lament is part of what covenant living looks like. Just like faith and just like praise and thanksgiving are. It is part of the package. And I can't imagine that we would ever say, well, I just don't praise God. Like, that's just not in my thing, right? Because it feels nonsensical to say that. It is just as nonsensical to say, but I don't lament. Like, that's just not my thing. Because it's part of the deal. It's part of what it means to have a relationship with God.
I think as you were talking, I was thinking, what are the deepest and most rewarding relationships in my life? And they're those with whom I have shared not just the happy moments, but sad moments as well. And so that makes a lot of sense to me. You discussed, Michael, how lament is a sacred space. What is it that sanctifies the space in which we lament?
Yeah, this, I think, is really interesting. We sometimes use the word sacred in a way that I think is not always helpful. Sometimes we use the word sacred to mean like the most spiritual or the bestest, right? It's the thing that's cooler than the other things. There's like the sacred and then there's everything else. But in ancient Israel, right, like if you had to do a grain offering, you would go out and you would gather your grain, and some portion of it would be taken to the temple and some portion of it would be kept at home. The portion that was taken to the temple became sacred. The stuff that was left at home became profane. It's not that like one was better than the other. It's not like these stalks of grain were the best stalks of grain and these were the worst. It was just one was given to God and one wasn't. That was the difference. What lament does is it allows us to take the thing we already have, which is our pain, our anguish, our sorrow, and it allows us to take them and proverbially package them up and then take them to the altar. And in the act of doing that, in the act of taking our pain and wrapping it up and taking it and handing it to God, the pain becomes sacred. It becomes an offering. It becomes a space of sacrifice, because now we are taking a thing that was ours and we are giving it to God. And I think that is what I mean when I say that lament can become, in a sense, it is the most sacred of offerings, because like you said, it's those moments when we are most vulnerable, most exposed, most uncertain, when our legs are the shakiest. We're taking that and we're saying, God, this is all I have left, is just this. And then you give it to God. And in my mind, like, there is no more special thing that we could give God. There's nothing more sacred than giving God the things about which we are most uncertain about.
That's beautiful. It made me think, I just taught Sunday school yesterday and we were talking about Enos, and we talked about how there are multiple prayers in the scriptures in which somebody designates a spot to go and pray to God. And so whether it's Enos going into the forest or Joseph Smith going into the sacred grove, and it's like, well, what is it that makes those spaces sacred. The sacred grove was not sacred until Joseph went there to pray. And so I think, to your point, like, it's up to us to designate these things as for God and to make them holy simply by our desire to seek him in that space. You ask the question at the end of the book, what comes after lament? What have you found comes after this?
Yeah, I sort of joke in the book that, like, the whole point is that we don't know what comes after lament, because what comes after lament is newness. And there's an anticipation of deliverance, and then there's newness. But we don't know what the newness is going to be. And in fact, we probably can't even predict. I use, one example that I use is the Israelites leaving Egypt, right? They didn't know where they were going. They just knew it was going to be something different. And where they ended up was a place they could not really have imagined, not really, because of the world in which they came in. They were slaves, and to imagine coming to a place where there were already trees planted and places for them to live, like that's a really dramatic form of deliverance that they probably couldn't have imagined. I think another, maybe the most stark example is the resurrection, where when Jesus died, the newness that resulted from his resurrection was not like a reinsertion into his old life. He didn't just go back to being a Nazarene who, someone from Nazareth who was 33 years old that was cruising around, right? He became something more. There was a newness, a new way of living. And I think that's where lament leads, is into a new way of being. For me, probably the most stark example comes with, honestly, my own faith. I went through a time when, and I talked about this sort of very briefly at the beginning, where for me, I needed something that I didn't have access to. And, sort of like I describe all of the walls of my faith kind of started to crumble. And the material was out there, and it was still fine material, but I figured out that I was built the wrong way. And I had to go back and rebuild my house. And the house I built is not the house I would have imagined in the beginning, but it's the right one now. And it's a newness that I didn't anticipate. Like it looks very different than I could have imagined. And I think that's the thing about lament, is in the moment of lament, we express through pain, and what comes after is a newness that we don't know what it will look like, but we have been promised that there is a newness. And it's sort of that, I think Pope Francis actually said it, that hope is an anchor we throw into the future. That's kind of what lament offers. It's the anchor we throw into the future, and where that will guide us is sometimes a little uncertain, but it's always going to be good.
That's very well said. Speaking of faith, I thought it was so interesting that at the end of the book, it feels like the book is essentially over. And then you have one last brief note about lament and, in quotes, faith crisis. Why was this important for you to include?
Yeah, so some of this, well, first of all, and I say this in the book, I'm not a big fan of the phrase faith crisis, but you put it in quotes, and it's right. Because it means lots of things to lots of people, but it's a useful shortcut to, signal like the notion that a lot of people who are members of the church are choosing to affiliate with other churches or no church at all. The reason I thought it was important is because I feel like, not for everybody, like I don't want to make global statements, but I feel like for a lot of people, the types of things that lead to those kind of moments of uncertainty, when we're faced with them, the choice is sometimes presented, maybe not this starkly, but sometimes this starkly, as, well, you just need to have faith, or you need to be, or you're faithless. It's a sort of like this either or, as if somehow praise, thanksgiving, right, is in a sense really the only answer. And I find that that's misguided, because what it presumes is that you can't have a relationship with God from the midst of uncertainty. At least that's what it seems to presume to me. And so, but that is exactly what lament is for. Lament is for moments of uncertainty. And I feel like if folks who are in that sort of like moment of uncertainty, of unsettledness, where things feel incoherent, realize that there is still a way and a language to hold to God. There's a way to talk to God from within that uncertainty. That there is a lot of pain that could be channeled differently. And I don't mean to say that like the purpose of lament is to keep people in the church, because that's not what it's for, but it's a spiritual tool that people just don't know about. And I feel like a lot of people who are in those moments of like really deep pain and sadness that sometimes accompany a faith crisis would benefit from the ability to say out loud to God, God, I don't understand. Why is this happening? Like, I feel like that's important to be able to say. So I guess it was in some ways, maybe that's a little more, closer to home, because I've seen my friends and others, go through those moments. And I feel like lament could have been a valuable tool for them.
Okay. I just have one last question before we get to our all-in question. One last quote that I wanted to touch on from the book. You say, our spiritual heritage is one of a God who is as open to songs of praise as to songs of lament. God is strong enough to be our God in all seasons of our life. It's probably because of that whole no flower blooms in every season that this quote stuck out to me, because I've had that replaying in my mind over and over again. But I love this idea of a God that is a God of all seasons. I wondered, for you in your own life, how have you seen that God is a God of all seasons?
Yeah. Listen, God is bigger than the boxes we build. And in my life, it is certainly true that I have felt God when I've been in a good place, when I've been praising and offering thanksgiving and like been in those moments of real elation. Like, I have felt God in those moments. But I think I can say with real, I think I'm trying to reflect on this. I think it's true that like the times when I have felt God's presence the most, like the most sort of like powerful acknowledgement that God has come when I had faith enough to be honest with how I felt in moments of pain. And it didn't make the pain go away, and it didn't fix the situation. But there was something about being able to say out loud that I hurt that really, for me, taught me what divine presence felt like. So that's a little bit of a non-specific answer, but, there's a lot of experience behind it.
No, I think that's perfect. And it calls to mind for me similar experiences. So I'm sure it does that for everyone. My last question for you is, what does it mean to you to be all in the gospel of Jesus Christ?
I think, this may not be terribly surprising based on the conversation we just had. For me to be all in is sort of characterized by like this notion of radical relationality. It is to be all in is to be in a relationship. It is to be connected to God. And the way that I connect to God is through other people and through creation. That's how I tie in. So to me, to be all in is to be in a relationship. That's what it looks like, is relationship.
Michael, thank you so much. This has been such a good discussion, and one that I will be thinking about for a while. So I really, really appreciate your time. And I also appreciate the time that you put into writing this book for all of us. So thank you very much.
Thanks for having me. And I appreciate the really good questions.
We are so grateful to Michael Huston for joining us on today's episode. You can find Michael's book, Even in the Darkest Hour, Lament as a Path to God, in Deseret bookstores now. Thanks to Derek Campbell for his help with this and every episode of this podcast. And thank you so much for listening. We'll look forward to being with you again next week.